On the morning of September 3, 1914, a fire consumed the private study of Cornelius Vanderbilt III in less than 40 minutes. Not the whole house, just the study. And the servants who witnessed it said he stood at the window watching the flames, making no effort to call for help. He simply watched, and when the last drawer of his mahogany desk turned to ash, he walked away. That image has never left me. 6 weeks later, he suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed. He never discussed that morning again. Not to family, not to his physician, not to a single friend whose letters have survived. 40 minutes and then 4 decades of silence. There are roughly 4 miles of subterranean passages beneath the Vanderbilt properties along Fifth Avenue and across their Newport estate at the Breakers. Engineers who surveyed the ground in the 1970s documented them. Architectural historians have footnoted them. Nobody has ever fully mapped them. The family's own foundation issued a statement in 1987 calling them service corridors for coal and domestic supply. 3 paragraphs. That was the complete explanation. Something underneath all this doesn't hold. The official story goes like this. The Vanderbilts, from the 1870s onward, were the defining family of American industrial wealth. Cornelius Vanderbilt had built the railroad empire from almost nothing, leveraging a combination of ruthlessness and timing that transformed how a continent moved goods and people. His descendants inherited not just money but a particular attitude, that infrastructure was destiny, that whoever controlled the channels through which things moved controlled everything. The mansions they constructed along Fifth Avenue weren't mere houses. They were statements of permanence. The tunnels beneath them, per the official account, were entirely mundane. Servants moved coal through them. Deliveries arrived without disturbing the main floors. This was how the wealthy lived at the turn of the century, and the Vanderbilt tunnels were simply a grander version of a common practice. Nothing unusual, certainly nothing worth burning documents over. Let me be fair to the official narrative because it deserves fairness. Service tunnels were absolutely standard in Gilded Age architecture. Richard Morris Hunt, who designed the breakers in Newport, routinely incorporated subterranean infrastructure into his estate plans. The logistics of running a household with dozens of servants, tons of coal per winter season, and hundreds of dinner guests required serious below-ground organization. The 1987 foundation statement isn't wrong on its face. And Cornelius III's study fire could, of course, be explained in any number of ordinary ways. A man burning personal papers before a health crisis is not in itself suspicious. People burn things. People have secrets that are simply personal, not conspiratorial. I accept all of that, but here's what matters. The fire happened 6 weeks before his stroke, not 6 weeks after. He burned those documents while healthy enough to stand at a window for 40 minutes. Whatever he was removing from the world, he removed it deliberately while he still had full command of himself. Let's start with the numbers. The Vanderbilt Fifth Avenue properties. There were eventually 4 connected or adjacent structures along what architects called Vanderbilt Row, occupied the stretch between 51st and 58th Streets. When the last of those buildings was demolished in 1947, the excavation crews filed reports that have sat in the New York City Department of Buildings archive for 77 years. I found this while researching something else entirely, specifically the 1926 rezoning disputes around Midtown. Buried in the excavation permits for the 1947 demolition is a surveyor's notation. It reads, "Below-grade passages of uncertain terminus discovered. Extent exceeds standard service utility design. Recommend further assessment." No further assessment was ever filed. The demolition proceeded. Uncertain terminus. That phrase. The standard service tunnel ran from a basement utility room to a coal delivery alley, maybe 60 feet, sometimes 100. Functional, direct, and enclosed within the property boundary. A passage of uncertain terminus suggests something that didn't terminate where a service corridor was supposed to terminate. It suggests a passage that went somewhere else. Speaking of names, There was a physician named Dr. Edmund Garrison who held a staff position at Cook County Hospital from 1887 to 1891. Garrison, he left the hospital in June of 1891, with no listed reason in the staff records. He resurfaced 18 months later as a medical consultant to the United States Army Medical Museum in Washington, D.C. The Army Medical Museum. In 1893, that institution published a catalog of its pathological collection. Among the entries, and I want to be precise here because precision matters, among the entries is a series of anatomical measurements described as belonging to a female subject of exceptional stature, acquired 1889, Chicago, Cook County. The entry number is 1147B. The measurements are consistent with a woman of approximately 7 feet in height. Entry 1147B is flagged in the catalog's index as subject deceased. Remains retained for scientific study per directive of the Surgeon General's office. Per directive of the Surgeon General's office. Which brings me to the political context, because here is where the picture widens in ways that are genuinely difficult to dismiss as coincidence. In 1889, the United States government was in the middle of a quiet but aggressive campaign to collect what the era called anthropological specimens. This is documented history, not fringe interpretation. The Surgeon General's office, the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of Ethnology, and several major university medical programs had formal, if largely informal, arrangements with hospitals in immigrant-heavy cities to identify and, after death, retain the bodies of individuals deemed scientifically notable. The criteria for scientifically notable in 1889 were as ugly as you'd expect. Racial difference, physical abnormality, unusual height, weight, cranial measurement. The word used in internal correspondence that is now partially available through the National Archives, was exceptional specimens. Marta Voss would have been, by those criteria, extraordinary. A 7'2" German immigrant woman in active labor in a Chicago hospital in 1889 would not have gone unnoticed by anyone with connections to that network. And Dr. J.R. Garrison, whatever his full name, took a position at the Army Medical Museum 4 years after her admission. That is either a line connecting 2 points or it is nothing. But here's what matters most, and this is the part one keep returning to: the child. The Illinois Children's Home and Aid Society transferred children to adoptive families, to church institutions, and occasionally to state facilities. Their records from 1889 to 1905 were largely maintained. Not perfectly, but largely. When researchers in the 1970s began excavating the history of Illinois child welfare, they were able to trace most of those 14 per month Cook County transfers through the system. Not all of them, but most. The 22 transfers from March 1889, 7 of them are untraceable. Not missing records in the usual sense. Records that were burned or flooded or simply never filed. These 7 have intake entries at the Aid Society and then nothing. No placement record. No mortality record. No transfer out record. They arrive in the ledger and then cease to exist within it. One of those 7 is the infant described as special case, referred by attending physician. 7 children disappeared into a welfare system that, for 18 others admitted that same month, worked more or less as intended. Maybe those 7 died in infancy and the records were lost. Maybe the Aid Society's filing system was inconsistent and these cases simply fell through administrative cracks. These are reasonable explanations. I hold them seriously, but then I find something else. I found this while pulling Aid Society annual reports from an Illinois state archive, not looking for anything related to Marta Voss at all. In the Aid Society's 1891 annual report, 2 years after the March anomaly, there is a reference, buried in a financial accounting section, to a category of transfer described as private placements, scientific families. This category appears in no other annual report before or after 1891. It accounts for 11 children placed between 1889 and 1891. It lists no names. No family destinations, only a total number and the phrase, as arranged. As arranged, 11 children, scientific families. As arranged, the timing is almost theatrical. Speaking of elsewhere, in 1910, 4 years before the study fire, Cornelius III commissioned a private survey of the Newport estate grounds. The surveyor's name was a man called Thomas Aldrich Pell, not related to the Pell family of Rhode Island as I initially assumed, but a civil engineer from Boston who had done prior work for the Pennsylvania Railroad. Pell completed his survey in 6 weeks and submitted his findings directly to Cornelius III. His fee was paid in cash, according to the estate's household ledger, which has been partially digitized through a private archive in Newport. The ledger notation reads, T.A. Pell, survey completion, private commission, no further description. That ledger entry is surrounded on both sides by completely routine domestic expenses. Firewood, boot blacking, linen replacement, and there, between the boot blacking and the linen, a cash payment in an amount equivalent to roughly $14,000 in today's value for a 6-week survey of property the family already owned and had owned since 1893. The timing is almost theatrical. Pell died in 1913, the year before the study fire. Heart failure, his obituary in the Boston Globe stated. He was 51 years old. He left no estate to speak of, despite 17 years of professional practice. He had no wife, no listed heirs, no professional papers deposited with any engineering institution. For a man of his standing and training, this absence of an archival footprint is genuinely unusual. Engineers of his era were meticulous record keepers. Their drawings, their field notes, their correspondence, these things survived because they were used, revised, and inherited by the next generation of practitioners. Pell left nothing, or nothing that's been found, which brings me to the winter of 1908. There are 2 letters in the Vanderbilt Family Correspondence Archive at the New York Historical Society, written by Cornelius III to his younger brother Alfred, that mention the tunnels directly. Not obliquely, directly. In the first letter, dated February 12, 1908, Cornelius writes, I have begun to understand what Father knew about the lower passages, and I confess it troubles me considerably. Not the passages themselves, but what their existence implies about the decisions made before our time. The second letter, dated 11 days later, reads only, disregard what I wrote last week. I have spoken with Burden, and I now see the matter differently. James Burden was the Vanderbilt's family attorney. After speaking with the family attorney, Cornelius decided the tunnels were no longer troubling. That shift happened in 11 days. Maybe that's innocent. A lawyer clarifies a legal question, puts a worried client's mind at ease. Maybe the tunnels carried some ambiguous property boundary implication and Burden sorted it out cleanly. Maybe what troubled Cornelius was purely juridical and the solution was purely practical. Maybe, but the letter says he came to understand something. Something that implied decisions made before his time. That language isn't about property boundaries. That's about choices. It's about purpose. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Here's what we know about the timeline of the passages themselves. The earliest documentary evidence of below-grade construction on the Fifth Avenue properties dates to 1879, during the building of the William Henry Vanderbilt House at 640 Fifth Avenue. The construction contracts for that project, held at Columbia University's Avery Architectural Library, include a line item for subfoundation gallery work performed by a subcontractor whose company name appears once and never again in any New York construction record. The company is listed as Denton and Morse Excavators, New Jersey. No New Jersey business registry from that period contains a Denton and Morse. The company doesn't exist in any trade directory, any newspaper mention, any legal record. A subcontractor that built 4 miles of underground passages and then ceased to exist in the public record. The timeline isn't subtle. I want to be careful here because this is the point at which any reasonable person starts asking whether I'm constructing a narrative from coincidences. I'm genuinely asking that of myself. Subcontractors went out of business constantly in the 1870s and 1880s. Cash-based work left minimal paper trails. A surveyor dying at 51 of heart failure in 1913 was not statistically unusual. A wealthy man burning personal papers before a medical crisis is simply a private act. I keep returning to Cornelius 3 standing at that window. 40 minutes. He watched his own documents burn for 40 minutes and never called for help. If you are burning personal letters, embarrassing financial records, old love correspondences, the ordinary human reasons people destroy papers, you don't stand and watch for 40 minutes. You light the fire, you leave the room, you put psychological distance between yourself and the act. Standing at the window for 40 minutes suggests something different. It suggests witnessing. It suggests a man making absolutely certain the work was complete. What was he certain about? Let's connect some of what we've established. The passages were built in 1879 by a contractor with no verifiable existence. They extended beneath multiple connected properties along one of the most surveyed and documented stretches of urban real estate in American history. In 1908, Cornelius III discovered something about their purpose that troubled him until a lawyer made it seem manageable. In 1910, he commissioned a private survey of the Newport tunnels, paid the surveyor in cash, and that surveyor died with no professional records the following year. In September 1914, Cornelius burned an unknown volume of documents over 40 minutes. 6 weeks later, he suffered a stroke and never discussed any of this again. Maybe these events are unconnected. Maybe the survey was about drainage and the lawyer sorted out a property line and the documents were love letters from a woman who wasn't his wife. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist. But consider what kind of tunnel you need to keep secret from a family that already owns the tunnel. The Vanderbilts knew the passages existed. The 1987 foundation statement proved that. They acknowledged them. What Cornelius III apparently didn't know, until 1908, was what the passages implied. The passages themselves weren't the secret. The purpose was the secret. And the purpose was something that predated him, something decided before his time, and something that troubled him even after the lawyer explained it away. What decisions get made before an heir's time and then buried underneath the inheritance? Let me offer 3 possibilities, not as conclusions but as frameworks for the evidence. The first possibility is entirely mundane corruption. The tunnels connected to adjacent commercial properties, possibly to locations the Vanderbilts wished to control without being publicly associated with. Railroad magnates who shaped legislation through political machines could use private subterranean access to communicate with, compensate, or otherwise manage relationships that couldn't happen at street level. In 1879, New York politics was deep in the Tammany Hall era. Private access routes between wealthy residences and certain intermediaries would have been enormously valuable. This explains a ghost subcontractor. It explains cash payments. It explains a lawyer making things seem manageable. The second possibility involves the physical tunnels as infrastructure for something rather than access to somewhere. The survey notation from 1947, uncertain terminus, suggests the passages extended beyond property boundaries. Beneath Fifth Avenue in 1879, there was considerably less underground infrastructure than today. A private passage that ran under a public street to connect with, say, a bank building or a private club, or a competing businessman's property across the avenue. This existed elsewhere in Gilded Age, New York. The Astors had documented access passages. Several of the major private clubs maintained unreported below-grade connections. A Vanderbilt tunnel that crossed Fifth Avenue and connected to the financial district's private infrastructure would be, depending on what moved through it, either a curiosity or a scandal. The third possibility is the one I find hardest to dismiss. The Vanderbilts controlled the railroads that moved everything America produced. They controlled the terminals, the freight yards, the physical infrastructure of commerce. If the tunnels beneath their private homes connected to that railroad infrastructure, if a passage ran beneath Midtown from their residential properties down toward Grand Central, which was already their domain, then the question becomes not what the tunnels were for, but what the family knew about how they were used that no amount of official documentation was ever going to show. Grand Central Terminal, completed in 1913, contained its own substantial subterranean world. The train lines, the platforms, the access corridors, and beneath all of that, Additional passages whose purpose has been
These are the
categorized as
cash
utility access,
payments
but whose
hidden
actual
from the
dimensions were noted by
ledger.
construction
It's
engineers
the
as
only way the
exceeding functional
framework
necessity. I
holds.
found
I
this in a
understand
1913 engineering trade
completely.
journal, a brief
We shall
notation in a progress
ensure
report
these
on the terminal's
funds are
completion.
managed
Exceeding functional
discreetly.
necessity. The Breakers Tunnel Survey happened in 1910. Grand Central opened in 1913. The surveyor died in 1913. Cornelius burned his study in 1914. The timing isn't subtle. I already said that, but I mean it differently now. Maybe the 1910 survey wasn't about understanding what the Newport tunnels were. Maybe it was about understanding whether anyone else knew what they connected to. Maybe Pell was hired not to map the passages but to assess their security, to determine whether the subterranean infrastructure the family had inherited, and perhaps never fully understood, had become visible to someone it shouldn't be visible to. Maybe when Pell died in 1913, his silence about whatever he'd found died with him. And maybe that silence was what the family lawyer helped Cornelius understand he needed to protect. Maybe. But here's what matters most about all of this. Cornelius Vanderbilt III lived until 1942. He had nearly 3 decades after that stroke to write a memoir, to deposit papers somewhere, to tell a single person what was in that study on the morning of September 3, 1914. He had money, lawyers, privacy, and time. He never said a word. That's not the behavior of a man who burned love letters. That's the behavior of a man who burned something he believed was genuinely dangerous to preserve. He stood at the window for 40 minutes. I keep coming back to that image because it feels true in a way that the official explanations never quite manage. The official explanations are coherent and plausible and reasonable. They're also curiously complete. They answer every question in the same direction, toward the mundane, toward the forgettable, toward the 4 paragraphs, and then silence. Real history usually leaves rougher edges. Real history leaves notations about uncertain terminuses and cash payments between boot blacking and linen replacement. Real history leaves an engineer dying at 51 with no papers and a lawyer's meeting that transformed troubling knowledge into manageable knowledge in 11 days. Real history leaves a man standing at a burning window. The Vanderbilt mansions are largely gone now. The last of the Fifth Avenue row came down in the 1940s and 1950s. The Breakers still stands, operated as a museum. If the tunnels beneath it remain, they are closed to visitors. The foundation describes them in 3 paragraphs. The excavations that surveyed them in the 1970s produced reports that are not publicly accessible. I called the Preservation Society of Newport County in 2022. I asked whether the below-grade passages at the Breakers were documented in any engineering survey from the 20th century. The woman who answered was professional and polite. She confirmed that below-grade service corridors existed. She said documentation was held in the estate's administrative archive. She said access to that archive required a formal research request and approval from the board. I submitted the request. 14 months later, I received a letter. Thanked me for my interest. It stated that the materials I'd requested were currently undergoing conservation assessment and are temporarily unavailable for researcher access. It was signed by an administrator whose name I won't include here because she's clearly just doing her job. Temporarily unavailable. Since 2022. And so I'm left where I started. With a man at a window, with passages of uncertain terminus beneath a family that controlled how America moved, with a surveyor who left no trace, with a lawyer who made troubling knowledge manageable in 11 days, with 40 minutes of fire and then 4 decades of deliberate, disciplined silence. I'm not telling you the Vanderbilt tunnels contain something catastrophic. I'm not telling you Cornelius III burned proof of a crime or a conspiracy that shaped the century. I don't know what he burned. Nobody alive knows what he burned. That's the whole point. A man with resources beyond imagination, in full health, in full possession of himself, stood at a window on a September morning and watched his own papers turn to nothing. And then he walked away. And then he had a stroke. And then he lived for 28 more years and said nothing about any of it to anyone who wrote it down. Somewhere beneath Newport, if the passages still exist, the stones that Denton and Morse cut in 1879 are still there, unmarked, unmapped, connected to something that exceeded functional necessity. And whatever they once connected, whatever moved through them, whoever used them, whatever decisions were made in the dark before Cornelius III was old enough to ask questions, that knowledge went into a fireplace on a Tuesday morning in 1914. And the man who fed it to the flames stood there until he was absolutely certain it was gone.